the quiet darkness of Austin, Texas, the summer of 1884 carried a weight heavier than the oppressive heat. The streets, lined with modest wooden homes and the occasional brick storefront, seemed at first glance ordinary, yet beneath the surface, a sinister presence crept through the shadows. Residents, moving cautiously along dusty roads, whispered about disappearances, strange noises in the night, and a sense of unease that no amount of light or company could dispel. Among the early victims were young servant girls, tasked with domestic labor, whose absence began as isolated incidents but quickly formed a pattern that the community could not ignore. The fear was palpable, almost a physical force pressing against the homes and hearts of those who remained. Every knock on a door, every footstep in the alley seemed magnified, resonating with the possibility of danger lurking unseen. It was in this tense atmosphere that the figure of the unknown assailant emerged, never caught, never identified, a shadow moving with uncanny precision through the lives of ordinary citizens. Local authorities, overwhelmed by the combination of fear, superstition, and limited investigative resources, could offer little comfort beyond the vague promise of patrols and vigilance. Neighbors, families, and domestic workers grew increasingly wary of the night, of the darkened streets, and even of the seemingly safe confines of their own homes. The ordinary domestic spaces, kitchens, bedrooms, servant quarters became sites of suspicion and anxiety, as if the very architecture of life had been transformed into a theater of silent horror. Every creaking floorboard, every flicker of candlelight, every distant cry took on an exaggerated significance in the collective imagination. Among the people of Austin, attention centered on the victims and their families, whose grief and terror became emblematic of the city's collective dread. Young women who previously moved confidently through their neighborhoods now hesitated at thresholds, casting anxious glances at shadowed alleys. Mothers worried incessantly, admonishing daughters to remain indoors after dusk, reinforcing the invisible but omnipresent sense of threat. The servants' quarters, once bustling with the rhythm of daily chores, now seemed haunted, every whisper amplified, every movement a reminder of the vulnerability of life. In this atmosphere, the unknown assailant's name, whispered as the Servant Girl Annihilator, became a symbol of fear, a personification of the city's dark anxieties, and a chilling reminder that danger could strike with meticulous, almost surgical precision. The first reports came with understated horror. A young girl, found lifeless on the outskirts of her home, was described in newspapers with a mixture of clinical detachment and sensationalized detail, highlighting both the brutality and the mystery surrounding the case. Each account fed the community's imagination, providing both evidence of mortal danger and fodder for speculation. Some believed in the supernatural, attributing the deaths to curses or malevolent spirits. Others focused on human malevolence, debating motives and methods, while authorities struggled to piece together a coherent understanding. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next incident, the next signal that the darkness had not yet retreated. Amid these uncertainties, ordinary citizens became both observers and participants in the unfolding drama. Nighttime routines changed, doors were barred earlier, lanterns burned longer, and groups of neighbors patrolled streets in tentative solidarity. Yet even these measures offered limited reassurance. The killer, methodical and elusive, remained outside the grasp of law, striking unpredictably, ensuring that each family and each household was reminded of the precariousness of safety. The line between daytime normalcy and nocturnal terror blurred. Every ordinary moment carried the latent possibility of catastrophe. Anxiety became a constant companion, shaping behaviors, conversations, and social interactions in ways both overt and subtle. In this environment, the story of the Servant Girl Annihilator transcended mere crime reporting. It became a narrative of human vulnerability, the fragility of domestic life, and the psychological weight of fear in a community unprepared for such relentless, mysterious violence. Observers marveled at the perpetrator's ability to move unseen, to exploit ordinary spaces, and to maintain anonymity, all while the city grappled with its collective terror. Each disappearance, each gruesome discovery, reinforced a sense that the ordinary world was no longer entirely predictable. Light could not banish the shadows. Presence could not ensure safety. The tension became almost cinematic, a slow crescendo of suspense, in which every ordinary household object, the latch on a door, a kitchen knife, a candle, was imbued with new significance. This was not the tale of a singular event, but of a series of moments strung together by fear, uncertainty, and the unknown. It was a narrative where the ordinary was transformed into the extraordinary, where domestic labor became a site of peril, and where the human mind, attuned to threat, interpreted every detail through the lens of survival. In the quietude of Austen's night, the Servant Girl Annihilator moved with a precision that defied comprehension, leaving behind only the echoes of lives interrupted, of shadows that seemed to linger longer than their sources, and of a city forever altered by the knowledge that evil could exist without form, without warning, and without capture. As the first chapter of this dark history unfolds, we are invited to witness not only the events themselves, but the ways in which ordinary lives intersected with extraordinary terror. The city, the homes, and the people became both stage and audience to a horror that was meticulous, relentless, and deeply human in its psychological impact. It is here, in this charged intersection of fact, fear, and narrative, that the story of the Servant Girl Annihilator begins, setting the stage for the historical, cultural, and psychological exploration that will follow. Each moment of suspense, each fleeting shadow, each whispered rumor contributes to a tapestry of tension, drawing the audience into the mysterious and chilling reality of 1884 Austen. In the mid-1880s, Austin, Texas was a city at the intersection of expansion and tradition, a frontier hub still emerging from the shadows of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Streets were unpaved, lined with modest wooden homes and scattered brick buildings, each with small yards where children played under the watchful eyes of mothers and older siblings. The city's population was diverse but segmented, reflecting social hierarchies and racial divisions that influenced every aspect of daily life. The growing town struggled with infrastructure, public safety, and the establishment of law enforcement capable of responding effectively to crimes, leaving residents to navigate both the physical and social hazards of their environment. Domestic labor was central to many households. Servant girls, often young women from rural areas or marginalized communities, undertook tasks that included cooking, cleaning, childcare, and tending to livestock. Their labor was physically demanding, socially circumscribed, and frequently invisible in the broader narrative of city life. These women moved through homes with a sense of duty and discipline, but their positions also rendered them vulnerable. With limited legal protections, they were dependent on the goodwill of employers and neighbors, making any disappearance or attack all the more terrifying. The pattern of the Servant Girl Annihilator's crimes exploited this vulnerability, targeting those whose work required them to navigate domestic spaces alone. Often at night, Austen streets reflected the tension between growth and precarity. Gas lamps illuminated certain thoroughfares while side streets remained in near darkness. Horses and wagons rattled over rough roads, adding noise and movement that both masked and accentuated the presence of danger. Neighborhoods varied widely. Wealthier families occupied larger homes with fences and watchful servants, while working-class families shared smaller plots with minimal protection. Public gathering spaces such as markets, churches, and town halls were hubs of social exchange, yet these too were tinged with unease as news of violent crimes spread. Newspapers circulated accounts of disappearances, combining factual reporting with sensationalized detail, reinforcing fear and curiosity in equal measure. The cultural context of the era heightened anxiety around the events. Victorian ideals of propriety, domesticity, and female virtue shaped perceptions of danger, particularly for young women in servitude. Society emphasized the need for obedience, modesty, and caution, leaving little room for the agency of women who were most at risk. At the same time, rumors of violence and crime became part of a broader cultural dialogue about morality, safety, and urban life. The Servant Girl Annihilator's actions violated these norms in a particularly egregious way, instilling a sense that not only were individuals at risk, but the moral order itself was threatened. Law enforcement in Austen during the 1880s was developing, but still limited in resources and coordination. Police officers patrolled on foot or horseback, often relying on community observation and informal reporting to track incidents. Investigations were hampered by the absence of modern forensic techniques, minimal record keeping, and the reliance on eyewitness testimony, which could be inconsistent or influenced by fear. The inability to identify or apprehend a perpetrator created an environment of speculation and heightened dread. Residents were left to improvise protective measures, relying on personal vigilance, neighborhood networks, and local rumors to anticipate danger. The physical environment compounded the psychological tension. Dense clusters of homes, narrow alleyways, and unlit courtyards provided concealment for both legitimate and nefarious activity. Windows were often shuttered, doors reinforced with rudimentary locks, and servants frequently required to work in isolation or during hours when the city's presence dwindled. The combination of isolation, structural vulnerability, and social dependence created a precarious setting, where ordinary domestic activities became potential sites of risk. In such a context, even minor incidents, a misplaced tool, a slipped step, a noise in the night could trigger panic and speculation about the presence of the unknown assailant. Social hierarchies and race relations also influenced perceptions and responses. The population included freed African Americans, European immigrants, and Anglo settlers, each with distinct social roles, vulnerabilities, and levels of protection. Servant girls, often drawn from marginalized groups, were positioned at the intersection of these hierarchies, and their visibility made them both indispensable and exposed. Fear of crime intersected with prejudice and social expectation, shaping narratives that circulated through households, churches, and newspapers. The anonymity of the assailant allowed residents to project anxieties, reinforcing social boundaries and perceptions of threat while obscuring concrete facts. Communication within the community was primarily oral, supplemented by local newspapers and town meetings. News traveled quickly, often distorted through repeated retellings, creating a feedback loop in which rumor amplified fear. Families reinforced cautionary practices, locking doors, limiting nighttime excursions, and increasing surveillance of servants. Neighborhood watch patterns emerged, with clusters of families coordinating patrols and sharing information. Yet these measures, though practical, could not eliminate the sense of vulnerability. The unknown nature of the threat created a pervasive psychological tension that lingered long after immediate danger had passed. The economic realities of Austin also shaped daily life and responses to crime. Households depended on servants not only for domestic labor, but for maintaining productivity and routine. Disruptions caused by the murder's absences, illness, or fear had tangible impacts on household operations. Employers, balancing concern for their staff with practical needs, often faced difficult decisions, enforcing curfews, modifying work routines, or taking additional precautions that were sometimes inconvenient or socially awkward. These practical considerations underscored how crime could ripple through multiple layers of urban life, affecting not only direct victims but the broader social fabric. Education and religious institutions played a dual role in shaping the community's understanding of these events. Churches provided moral guidance and social oversight, often framing violent acts within theological contexts of sin, punishment, and moral responsibility. Schools and informal gatherings reinforced cautionary lessons, embedding narratives of danger into collective memory. Through sermons, neighborhood conversations, and local reporting, residents internalized both the factual elements of the murders and the heightened sense of dread that accompanied them. This interplay of fact, fear, and moral instruction contributed to a cultural environment in which anxiety became a defining characteristic of daily life. In summary, the setting of Austin, Texas in 1884 was a city of contrasts: growth and precarity, visibility and isolation, social structure and vulnerability. The Servant Girl Annihilator's murders occurred against this backdrop, exploiting the interplay of domestic labor, social expectation, and environmental risk. Households were vulnerable, streets were uneven and poorly lit, and the psychological impact of fear amplified every shadow and sound. The community responded with improvised vigilance, moral interpretation, and social coordination. Yet the unknown assailant remained elusive, leaving a lingering sense of suspense and dread. The historical context illuminates not only the practical vulnerabilities of urban life, but also the psychological and cultural dimensions of terror in a frontier city struggling to reconcile modernity, morality, and safety. Understanding this environment is essential to comprehending the scale, impact, and enduring fascination of the Servant Girl Annihilator murders. The first attack occurred on a quiet street in East Austin, where a young servant girl named Clara moved with the habitual efficiency demanded by her chores. The evening was heavy with heat, and the last vestiges of daylight lingered across the rough wooden fences. Clara's tasks required her to move between rooms, carrying water, tidying cooking implements, and securing the household's few valuables. In that ordinary motion, a shadow detached itself from the periphery of her vision. A sudden shove, barely audible but violently jarring, sent her sprawling across the uneven floorboards. Neighbors later recounted the frantic movements, the startled cries that fractured the calm, and the realization that this was no ordinary stumble. Something unseen had intervened, an intentional disruption that left both physical bruises and an enduring sense of fear. The house, once secure, had become a site of latent danger, its familiar corners now potential loci of attack. Within days, a second incident confirmed the pattern. Margaret, another young domestic worker, was tending to the kitchen fire when the room seemed to darken unnaturally. The flames flickered, throwing distorted shadows across the walls, and the door creaked as if under pressure. A sudden, precise blow from an unknown source struck her shoulder, and she fell against a wooden table, narrowly avoiding a cast-iron pot that threatened to crush her. The household reacted with alarm, yet there was no sign of a perpetrator. Every movement was scrutinized, every sound elevated to the level of potential threat. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, neighbors peered from windows, and an overarching anxiety permeated the air. The ordinary act of cooking had become an arena of suspense, illustrating how domestic labor itself was transformed under the pressure of invisible menace. A week later, another case unfolded in a similarly disturbing pattern. A young servant girl named Eliza was ascending the narrow stairs to the servants' quarters when a splintered beam, seemingly loosened by unknown hands, shifted under her weight. She fell, narrowly avoiding the sharp edges of broken wood, and the sound of her scream carried through the house. Family members rushed to her side, yet no one saw any intruder. The incident, like the previous ones, emphasized the meticulous nature of the attacks. They were not chaotic, but carefully orchestrated to instill maximum terror while remaining unseen. The psychological impact on the household was immediate and profound. Even after Eliza recovered physically, the sense of vulnerability remained. In another instance, the use of sharp implements elevated tension to a deadly degree. A knife left on a kitchen counter, ordinarily a tool of necessity, was discovered at night with subtle but deliberate displacement, suggesting interference with intent. A servant girl, performing routine cleaning, reached for it and felt the weight differently than expected, almost tipping from the balance of calculation and accident. This minor deviation caused panic. She dropped the knife, narrowly avoiding serious injury. But the realization that ordinary tools could harbor latent danger intensified fear across the community. Doors, windows, and even furniture became elements in a hidden choreography of threat. Neighbors observed unusual vigilance, parents restricted movements, and the community collectively internalized the presence of a precise and unpredictable menace. The attacks were not confined to minor falls or scares. One of the most chilling incidents occurred on a moonless night when a servant girl named Lydia, returning from a nearby market, was ambushed along a dimly lit lane. Witnesses described a shadow moving with unnatural speed, forcing Lydia to the ground. She managed to escape with only minor injuries, yet the intensity of the encounter left a lasting imprint on the neighborhood's psyche. The event demonstrated the assailant's capacity for both stealth and control, transforming ordinary streets into corridors of tension and paranoia. Residents reported lingering feelings of being watched, and the night's quiet was broken by the imagined, if not real, echoes of pursuit. An attack involving fire brought a new level of dread. A servant girl performing evening chores noted a lantern knocked askew in the hallway. The flame flickered dangerously, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently. The girl quickly adjusted the lantern, but the heat scorched her arm slightly, and the possibility of an uncontrolled fire sent the household into immediate crisis. The near disaster underscored how everyday objects could become instruments of terror when manipulated with intent. Families reevaluated routines, securing flammable materials, monitoring servant activity, and reinforcing structural vulnerabilities. Every ordinary object, from pots to lanterns, became a potential vector for danger in a home no longer entirely safe. The reaction to these incidents extended beyond the immediate victims. Households neighboring the affected homes reported similar patterns: inexplicable sounds, minor injuries, and subtle manipulations of furniture and household implements. Community members began to discuss in detail the movements of servants, the timing of chores, and the shadows cast by street lamps. The assailant's methodology, unseen, precise, and consistent, generated a network of anxiety that transcended individual families, embedding the murders into the collective consciousness. Fear became both protective and paralyzing. Vigilance increased, but so did tension and mistrust. Another pattern emerged in which stairways, narrow passages, and isolated rooms became focal points for terror. Servant girls navigating these spaces reported subtle pressures: a floorboard shifted, a railing loosened, or a door not fully secured, events that produced fear disproportionate to physical harm. Each incident reinforced the notion that everyday environments could conceal lethal intent. Household members responded by creating complex monitoring routines. Doors were checked repeatedly, lanterns kept alight longer, and neighbors coordinated informal watch rotations. The psychological impact, cumulative over weeks, was as significant as the physical threat, embedding a persistent sense of vulnerability into domestic life. Even ordinary social interactions carried the weight of potential danger. Conversations with employers, other servants, and neighbors were filtered through the lens of suspicion. Questions about movements, timings, and alibis became routine, and previously casual relationships took on a tense formality. The unknown assailant's presence, though invisible, structured the rhythms of life, dictating when and how people moved, spoke, and observed. Everyday life became a careful dance, each step measured against an awareness of potential peril. Shadows in hallways, the creak of a floorboard, and the fleeting glimpse of movement were sufficient to provoke alarm, illustrating how deeply fear had penetrated the social fabric. In one particularly dramatic episode, a servant girl narrowly avoided being crushed under a falling beam, reportedly loosened moments before by unknown intervention. The near catastrophe was witnessed by family members, who described the tension as almost unbearable, a mixture of anticipation, panic, and relief. Such incidents demonstrated not only the assailant's careful timing, but also the amplified psychological effect on observers. Fear became a shared experience, binding families and neighbors in mutual vigilance while reinforcing the mysterious, almost ritualized nature of the attacks. These incidents collectively illustrate the calculated, relentless nature of the Servant Girl Annihilator. Each attack was designed to instill terror while avoiding capture, transforming ordinary domestic spaces into arenas of suspense and danger. The community, caught between practical response and psychological strain, adjusted routines, reinforced vigilance, and grappled with the invisible presence shaping every moment. Shadows, sounds, and objects were no longer neutral. They carried the weight of anticipation, the potential for injury, and the constant reminder that the ordinary world could be permeated by an extraordinary threat. As these incidents unfolded, the narrative of terror became inseparable from the social, cultural, and domestic realities of Austin. The meticulous orchestration of danger, combined with the psychological toll on the community, created a historical record that transcends mere crime reporting. The interplay between human behavior, environmental factors, and social expectation produced a climate of persistent tension, demonstrating how violence can reshape ordinary life, transform domestic spaces, and imprint fear into the collective consciousness. Each fall, each displaced object, and each near miss contributed to a larger tapestry of horror, one that continued to resonate long after the immediate danger had passed. The news of the Servant Girl Annihilator's attacks spread through Austin like wildfire, leaving the community gripped by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and outrage. Families huddled together in the evenings, discussing the latest incidents in hushed tones, wary of attracting attention from an unknown assailant. Mothers admonished daughters to remain indoors after dusk, while fathers and older brothers patrolled streets in protective circuits, attempting to reclaim some measure of safety in a city that seemed increasingly hostile. Even as local authorities attempted to provide reassurance, their limited investigative resources and inability to capture the assailant only intensified public anxiety. The invisible presence of a precise and relentless threat transformed every ordinary household and street corner into a theater of suspense. Newspapers chronicled each incident, with a mix of clinical detail and sensational narrative, capturing the horror while feeding the public imagination. Headlines described the attacks with lurid terminology, highlighting the vulnerability of young servant girls and emphasizing the randomness of the violence. Articles were often speculative, blending eyewitness accounts with conjecture, and readers pored over each paragraph for clues, guidance, or a sense of control over the seemingly uncontrollable events. The press inadvertently amplified fear, as families read the accounts aloud, adding dramatic emphasis to every detail, reinforcing the impression that the threat was omnipresent and inescapable. Clergy and religious leaders interpreted the attacks through moral and theological frameworks, warning of sin, divine retribution, or the corrupting influence of urban life. Sermons emphasized vigilance, obedience, and the cultivation of virtue as protective measures, connecting moral conduct with physical safety. Families internalized these teachings, instructing daughters and servants not only to perform their duties diligently, but also to navigate the world with spiritual caution. The framing of these events within a moral context added an additional layer of psychological weight, intertwining fear of physical harm with anxiety over moral failure. Medical professionals of the era, though limited by the scientific understanding of crime and trauma, attempted to provide explanations and interventions. Doctors examined victims, recording injuries, noting patterns, and offering practical advice for prevention. Yet their recommendations were constrained by the lack of modern forensic tools. The inability to determine exact mechanisms of the assaults, whether accidental, deliberate, or influenced by environmental factors, left families in a liminal space between medical advice and superstition. Some practitioners speculated on neurological or psychological conditions in victims, suggesting heightened sensitivity or suggestibility, while others emphasized practical precautions such as reinforced doors and controlled movement within households. Neighboring families developed intricate networks of observation, employing collective vigilance to mitigate risk. Community members coordinated informal patrols, watched for suspicious activity, and exchanged information about sightings, movements, or potential threats. This communal response created a double-edged effect. While it increased surveillance and protective capacity, it also magnified anxiety, as the presence of multiple observers heightened awareness of danger and facilitated a culture of constant suspicion. Even casual interactions carried an undercurrent of tension, as residents filtered social contact through the lens of risk assessment. Letters and personal diaries provide a vivid window into domestic reactions. Mothers expressed profound fear for the well-being of their daughters, recounting sleepless nights and obsessive checking of doors and windows. Employers worried about the continuity of domestic labor, balancing concern for their staff with the practical need to maintain household operations. Young servant girls documented experiences of dread, describing the unnerving sensation of moving through spaces once considered safe, noting the heightened awareness of every shadow and every creaking floorboard. Collectively, these personal accounts illustrate the psychological reach of the attacks, demonstrating how fear permeated every level of social interaction. Even children absorbed the atmosphere of terror. They became alert to unusual sounds, suspicious movements, and changes in routine. Playtime was shortened, restricted to well-lit and supervised areas, and games often reflected anxieties about hidden threats. Parents reinforced these behaviors, teaching caution as a survival skill and embedding an early awareness of vulnerability into the socialization process. The assailant's unseen presence thus extended influence beyond direct victims, shaping behavior, expectation, and perception across generations. Local authorities attempted to maintain order, issuing warnings, suggesting patrols, and occasionally questioning suspects. However, their effectiveness was limited by procedural constraints, technological limitations, and social resistance. Families were sometimes reluctant to provide detailed testimony, either out of fear of retaliation or embarrassment, while inconsistent reporting complicated efforts to identify patterns. Law enforcement efforts were further hampered by the assailant's skill in evading detection, leaving investigators frustrated and reinforcing the perception that ordinary protective measures were insufficient. Psychological interpretations began to emerge, though rudimentary by modern standards. Observers noted that fear itself seemed to alter behavior, making individuals more cautious, suspicious, and alert to minor cues. The phenomenon of hypervigilance, although not formally defined, became evident in households where repeated exposure to danger transformed daily routines into complex risk avoidance strategies. Even after immediate threats subsided, the residual anxiety persisted, reflecting the lasting impact of trauma on community consciousness. Public discourse, whether in sermons, newspapers, or casual conversation, often blended moral, social, and practical guidance. Families were instructed to reinforce physical barriers, maintain visibility at all times, and cultivate prudence in domestic labor. Moral frameworks emphasized obedience, caution, and ethical conduct, while practical advice focused on prevention and the avoidance of isolated spaces. The combination of these approaches illustrates the multi-layered response to an invisible threat, in which social, spiritual, and cognitive dimensions intertwine to form a comprehensive, if imperfect, strategy for coping with fear. The reactions of the community reveal a city negotiating vulnerability in a frontier environment. Ordinary life, preparing meals, performing chores, traveling streets, was reframed through a lens of caution and anticipation. Domestic spaces became carefully monitored arenas, while social interaction carried the subtle tension of surveillance and suspicion. The community's collective response, though reactive, reflects both adaptive and psychologically potent strategies, demonstrating how social structures can respond to persistent, invisible threats. Fear, in this context, became both a protective mechanism and a source of prolonged distress, shaping behaviors and perceptions long after each incident had occurred. In this complex interplay between crime, culture, and psychology, the Servant Girl Annihilator's influence extended beyond physical attacks. The presence of a meticulous, anonymous assailant created a pervasive sense of danger that penetrated homes, streets, and social consciousness. Families adopted heightened vigilance, religious and moral instruction reinforced caution, medical practitioners advised on safety, and neighborhoods coordinated surveillance. Together, these responses illuminate not only the immediate impact of the murders, but also the enduring social and psychological consequences, revealing how fear can shape communities, redefine ordinary spaces, and leave a legacy of vigilance and apprehension that outlasts the visible threat. The crescendo of terror unfolded on a late summer evening, when the city of Austin seemed to hold its collective breath. Street lamps flickered across dusty roads, their dim light falling unevenly on sidewalks and wooden fences, casting long shadows that twisted in the night breeze. In a modest household on the edge of East Austin, young servant girls carried out their evening routines with heightened vigilance, aware that the shadow of the Servant Girl Annihilator might lurk anywhere. Their movements were careful, deliberate, almost ritualistic, each step measured against an invisible threat. The ordinary cadence of domestic life had become a tense choreography of survival. It began with the faintest creak, a sound that would have gone unnoticed on any other night. Yet in the charged atmosphere, it resonated like a clarion warning. Sarah, a servant girl known for her meticulous attention to duty, paused mid-step, hand resting on a kitchen door frame. She listened. Another creak, then the subtle scraping of a floorboard under weight that did not belong to any household member. Panic prickled the skin, but instinct propelled her forward. The air seemed to thicken. Every shadow stretched unnaturally. Her breathing quickened, but she maintained composure, knowing that hesitation might prove fatal. Suddenly, a force struck from the darkness, a swift, almost invisible blow that sent her sprawling across the rough floorboards. The room's lantern swung violently, casting chaotic light across the walls. She scrambled to her feet, heart hammering, as a series of rapid, deliberate noises echoed through the house. A chair tipped, a cupboard door slammed, the metallic clatter of a dropped utensil. The assailant was present yet unseen, orchestrating chaos with precision. Each sound amplified fear, turning the familiar kitchen into a stage for unseen malevolence. Neighbors, alerted by the commotion, pressed faces to windows. The interplay of light and shadow transformed ordinary structures into spectral forms. Trees swayed like silent sentinels, their branches scratching against wooden siding, contributing to the sense of pervasive danger. The air was thick with anticipation. Time seemed to stretch, elongating moments of suspense into an unending present. Every creak, every shadow was scrutinized, magnified, and interpreted as a sign of imminent threat. Meanwhile, another servant girl, Emily, attempted to assist. She moved with urgency, carrying a lantern that illuminated her path with wavering light. The lantern revealed glimpses of movement shadows that shifted without source, doors slightly ajar, objects displaced. She called out softly, but her voice seemed swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The assailant's presence was felt rather than seen, a calculated, invisible force that manipulated both space and perception. Panic threatened to overtake caution, yet training and instinct compelled measured response. The household collectively navigated a gauntlet of anticipation and terror, each member acutely aware of how small mistakes could be fatal. The tension escalated as the assailant employed environmental hazards with chilling precision. A floorboard gave way under deliberate pressure, sending a girl tumbling into a low table. Nearby, a lantern was jostled, flames threatening to ignite the drapery. Every object became a potential instrument of harm. The invisible hand of the assailant transformed mundane domestic tools into agents of terror. Household members reacted with instinctive agility, but fear sharpened each movement. And the psychological weight of the unknown amplified every minor incident into a life-or-death event. Outside, neighbors coordinated cautious observation, their presence adding a layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. Some patrolled quietly along fences and alleyways, listening for footsteps or disturbances. Others remained at windows, eyes straining through darkness, trying to anticipate or intercept any potential threat. The collective vigilance was both protective and anxiety-inducing, as the anticipation of violence pervaded every corner of the neighborhood. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if time had slowed, elongating each second into a suspense-laden eternity. A sudden, startling movement drew attention to the upper story of the house. A shadow flitted across the landing, barely discernible against the dim light of a lantern. Footsteps descended with precision, deliberate but inaudible on the wooden boards. A second assailant? Or the same invisible presence, moving with almost supernatural stealth? The uncertainty heightened fear exponentially. Each household member recalibrated attention, scanning, listening, preparing for the next unexpected act of aggression. The psychological tension reached a peak. The ordinary became extraordinary, and each step, each breath, became weighted with potential consequences. At the climax of this harrowing night, the assailant appeared briefly in partial light, a fleeting glimpse through the corner of the eye, enough to confirm presence without revealing identity. The moment was electric, a mixture of relief and terror, as the human mind attempted to reconcile perception with reality. The assault itself was brief but intense, involving rapid strikes and precise manipulation of environmental hazards. Furniture toppled, objects were displaced, and the household's defensive measures were tested to their limits. The calculated nature of the attack demonstrated both skill and meticulous planning, emphasizing the assailant's ability to control space, perception, and psychological impact. By the time the commotion subsided, the household was physically intact, yet psychologically transformed. Fear lingered in the air like a tangible residue, heavy and persistent. Conversations were hushed, movements cautious, and every creak or shadow scrutinized for signs of lingering presence. The invisible hand of the assailant had left its mark, altering the rhythms of domestic life, the confidence of household members, and the perception of the surrounding community. Every object, every corner, every passageway was now a potential locus of danger, and the psychological impact would persist long after the night ended. Neighbors and extended families gathered in the aftermath, offering aid, reassurance, and collective vigilance. Discussions focused on potential motives, methods, and the identity of the assailant, though no conclusions could be drawn. Fear had become a shared currency, binding households and neighborhoods in mutual concern and collaborative surveillance. Each participant in the evening's events carried forward a heightened awareness, an acute sensitivity to environmental cues, and a persistent anxiety that transformed ordinary domestic spaces into arenas of potential threat. The climactic incidents of that night exemplify the apex of suspense in the Servant Girl Annihilator narrative. They illustrate how ordinary domestic routines were transformed into perilous, psychologically charged experiences under the influence of an unseen, meticulous threat. The combination of stealth, environmental manipulation, and psychological orchestration created an intense, immersive terror, leaving victims, observers, and the broader community profoundly affected. These events serve as a powerful testament to the capacity of calculated violence to reshape perception, instill enduring fear, and redefine the ordinary landscapes of daily life. The terror did not end with that night. It reverberated across households, streets, and social consciousness. Each fall, each displaced object, each fleeting shadow contributed to an ongoing narrative of fear and vigilance. The climax revealed not only the technical skill and calculated cruelty of the assailant, but also the profound resilience and resourcefulness of the community in responding to invisible, unpredictable danger. In this interplay between unseen menace and human response, the boundaries of safety, perception, and ordinary life were forever altered, leaving an indelible imprint on the social and psychological landscape of Austin, Texas. In the quiet aftermath of the Servant Girl Annihilator's terror, Austin began to breathe again, yet the shadow of those nights lingered in the collective memory. Families remained vigilant long after the immediate attacks ceased, doors and windows reinforced, lanterns burning later into the night, and street patrols continuing informally. The ordinary rhythms of life were never fully restored. Even the sunlit streets held the whisper of past dread. Children who had witnessed or absorbed the fear grew up with an acute awareness of vulnerability, a psychological imprint of an assailant who had never been caught, whose methods were never fully understood. Speculation about the identity of the perpetrator persisted for decades. Some theorized that the attacks were the work of a single meticulous individual, whose understanding of domestic spaces allowed for precise, unseen manipulation. Others considered the possibility of multiple actors, coordinated or inspired by a common intent, leaving no trace but fear. These conjectures, though unconfirmed, became part of local lore, stories whispered at community gatherings, recounted in letters and diaries, and eventually entering broader historical narratives of Austin. The inability to resolve the mystery cemented the case's place in the cultural consciousness. A reminder that terror need not be visible to be profoundly real. Historical records reveal that survivors often experienced lingering psychological effects. Many developed heightened anxiety, hypervigilance, or phobias related to enclosed spaces, stairs, or nighttime routines. Some left the city entirely, seeking distance from the site of trauma, while others remained, adapting their lives around precautionary rituals that echoed the rhythms of those harrowing nights. Domestic architecture subtly changed as families reinforced structural elements, reconsidered household layouts, and incorporated observation points to monitor movements within and outside their homes. Fear, invisible yet pervasive, reshaped not only social behavior, but also physical space. The city's broader social fabric also absorbed the impact. Neighbors coordinated security measures, community networks strengthened, and local authorities adjusted patrols and investigative methods in response to the previously unthinkable. While the immediate threat vanished, the cultural and procedural adaptations endured. Schools, churches, and workplaces began to incorporate discussions of safety, caution, and communal vigilance, subtly reinforcing the lessons learned through fear. The Servant Girl Annihilator's legacy thus extended beyond individual victims, influencing social norms and communal practices in Austin for generations. Yet the unresolved nature of the murders left a haunting ambiguity. Could the assailant have continued elsewhere, targeting other cities or households under different names? Were their contemporaneous attacks misattributed or forgotten, their connection to the Servant Girl Annihilator obscured by incomplete records? Historians continue to examine archival materials, cross-referencing newspaper accounts, diaries, and official reports, seeking patterns that might reveal new insights. Every discovered detail, no matter how minor, invites speculation, blurring the line between documented history and enduring myth. Medical and psychological analyses, though limited in the 19th century, provide insight into both the victims and the broader community. Contemporary observers noted the physiological and emotional strain on survivors, documenting symptoms of chronic anxiety, sleeplessness, and heightened startle responses. Modern interpretations suggest that the persistent sense of threat experienced by victims and witnesses could be categorized under early understandings of trauma, illustrating how prolonged exposure to fear can reshape human perception, behavior, and social interaction. In this sense, the Servant Girl Annihilator's influence extends beyond physical harm, demonstrating the profound psychosocial impact of unseen violence. In reflection, the events of 1884 illustrate the complex interplay between human vulnerability, environmental manipulation, and societal response. Ordinary spaces, homes, kitchens, stairways, streets were transformed into stages of suspense, their mundane familiarity subverted by invisible, calculated danger. The psychological architecture of fear became as significant as the physical acts themselves, shaping behavior, expectation, and community dynamics in ways that persist in collective memory. Even without resolution, the narrative of terror provides a lens through which to examine the fragility of safety, the resilience of human adaptation, and the lasting imprint of fear. Ultimately, the Servant Girl Annihilator remains a ghost within Austin's history, a figure simultaneously real and elusive, whose presence continues to inspire curiosity, caution, and reflection. The attacks, meticulously orchestrated and psychologically profound, left an indelible mark on families, neighborhoods, and social consciousness. Their story is not merely one of crime, but of human adaptation to terror, the unseen forces that shape behavior, and the enduring fascination with the unresolved and the mysterious. In pondering the fate of the assailant, the survivors, and the city itself, one is left with a lingering awareness. History, when suffused with fear, retains its power long after the events themselves have passed, leaving echoes in every shadow and whisper in every silent corridor.